Hey folks, welcome back to Real Estate Investing Unmasked. Today we're going to talk about step 2 in how to buy a house. The last step we figured was, how do you know if you're ready to buy a house? This step is, how much house can you afford? And this step has to be broken up, and there's some math involved. So I'm going to try to keep as few numbers in here as possible, because I know when you start mentioning numbers, you start to lose people. So the biggest thing that you need to know in how much home can you afford is, what is debt to income? DTI. What is debt to income? This is a ratio that banks look at to see if you are able to afford the loan or not. So how much house you can afford is very strongly dependent on how much debt you have and how much debt you can hold. Okay, so there's a variety of opinions on this. If you are debt free, you're in good standing. If you have a high credit score, you're in good standing. See, what happens is, between 25 and 28% is what most lenders say you should have as debt to income, according to your gross income. So what does that mean? 25 to 28%. That means if you make $10,000 a month, just for easy numbers, $10,000 a month, and you're going to get a house payment of $2,500 a month, $2,500 a month, that is 25% of your gross income. That's before taxes. 28% would be $2,800. Okay, so it's that easy. You take your income, your gross income, and you multiply it by 0.25 or 0.28. And between those numbers, that's where people recommend it. Now, if you go with the low end, right, Dave Ramsey would say no more than 25% of your income. And if you go on the high end, they say 28%. Now that's just for the mortgage payment. When you include the debt, other debt besides the mortgage, then you have the experts say no more than 36% debt to income, all debts combined. So out of that example that I gave of a gross income of $10,000 a month, that means no more than $3,600 a month should be going toward debt. But if you're debt free, it's going to make it a lot easier for you, right? Now, why would Dave Ramsey say 25% if you're going with his method and you're debt free? The idea is that with Dave Ramsey, he teaches for you to put in 15% toward your retirement. So if you're doing 25% toward your mortgage and 15% towards your retirement, that's 40%. So that kind of gives you the threshold to kind of understanding where Dave Ramsey and some of the other people like him are coming from. Other people like NerdWallet, Investopedia, Bigger Pockets, a lot of them will go with the 36% on the debt to income with all debts considered. So what does that mean for you? Well, because interest rates fluctuate, the amount of house that you can afford is very dependent on what payment you can make. So once you've taken your income, your gross income before taxes and everything else, and you multiply that by 0.25, that's probably the easiest way to do it. So 1/4 of your gross income, then you know how much your mortgage payment can be. Once you know how much your mortgage payment can be, then you can kind of play around with some calculators. You'll need to go to sites like bankrate.com or other similar sites that will tell you what the current market rates are. And if you know what the current market rates are, and you know what your house payment that you can afford based on your 25% of your gross income, then that gives you an idea of how much house you can afford without feeling house poor. You don't want to feel house poor. That's probably one of the worst things you can feel. So you want to make sure that you have a high enough emergency fund and savings. Emergency fund and savings. And the reason for this, so now that we know what kind of payment you can make, we also need to know what kind of down payment you have available. So even if you have a very high income and you're saying, hey, I can afford a very high payment, the problem is you may not have a down payment to get that loan in the first place. So there's a kind of a teeter-totter. You have to have enough down payment, and you have to be able to afford the monthly payments. So here's what I would suggest. Get your gross income, multiply it by the 25% so you know what your monthly payment can be. See what kind of loan that says it can afford you. For instance, maybe it says you can afford a $400,000 loan. Just toss the numbers out in the air, although that probably would be pretty close. So maybe a lender says you can afford $2,500 a month, and that will give you a $400,000 loan. Here's the other thing to consider. A lot of times in your payment, when you're looking at websites like bankrate.com and similar websites, they will only quote you what your mortgage payment will be for principal and interest, but they leave out what your taxes and your insurance is going to be. So when you're figuring a loan and you're looking at those websites that show you the current rates, what I want you to do is I want you to add 2%. So if the going rate right now is 2%, I want you to do it as if it's 4%. The reason for that is because a lot of the taxes and insurance across the board, kind of the average, is about 1% of your loan for insurance and about 1% of your loan for taxes. And if you kind of figure that, and I know it's not exact and it's going to depend very much so on what area you're in. For instance, in the area I am in, it's about it's about 2, maybe 2.25% of what I bought the place for. In your area, you could be in a very high property tax area and insurance costs are low, or you could be in an area where property taxes are really low and insurance costs are also really low, so it may be lower. Because you're at the beginning steps of buying a home, you kind of have to have just a go-to number that says this shows me whether I can afford the house or not. So by taking 2%, one for taxes and one for insurance, they'll kind of balance each other out. And so if you say, hey, the going rate right now is 2.5%, you add those 2%, now it's 4.5%, is what you're going to put into the mathematical formula for buying the house on one of these mortgage calculator websites. And that will give you a very good idea of how much home you can afford. The other thing to keep in mind, let's say you're in a very expensive area, you really want to buy that house, and that's fine, you got a good down payment. You can have a higher than a 0.25 debt to income. You can go higher if your credit score is higher. The higher your credit score, the higher they'll allow you to go. For instance, when I was buying my first house, it's been almost 20 years ago, I bought my first house. And when I did, they told me my credit score was so high that they would allow me to go to a 50% debt to income. Now, that would have been terrible. It would have been absolutely terrible. It would have been a mistake if I'd have gone 50%. But because my credit score was so high, they would have allowed me, that's my point, they would have allowed me to go to 50%. What you don't want to do is when you go house hunting, have your realtor say, oh, well, you're looking in this price range, but if we just go a little bit more, then this is what you can get. Well, that little bit more may cause it to go from being affordable to not affordable anymore. So in order to buy a house, the second step is to know how much home you can afford. And you got to go through the math. You got to take your gross income, and I would suggest going with the 0.25 first. And then once you know how much a quarter of your gross income is, and you know what kind of house payment you can afford, then go to the calculators, find out what dollar amount will fit so that your payment will show up. That's when you know what your highest limit is. So if you put it in there and it says at $400,000 your payment is $2,500 a month, you know you will not buy a house more than $400,000. Although if you start at the lowest end, that 25% debt to income, and you see, okay, at $400,000, then $2,500 is what I can afford, you might be able to go up if your credit's better to go up to maybe 410 or 425, something similar, because you started at the low end at the 25% debt to income. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you have no debt, then that's probably going to give you that ability to increase. But that gives you the best number to start with how much I can afford. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask down below. Don't forget to like, and I will be continuing on in this journey. This is number 2 of, I believe it's 11 steps. So you'll want to subscribe to see the next steps that come out. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.